Welcome to another episode of Scottish Murders. So this week's episode is an update episode, specifically an update on an unsolved murder case we covered back in 2021, our second ever episode, the unsolved murder of George Murdoch, a 58-year-old taxi driver in Aberdeen on the 29th of September 1983. I was so pleased when, after releasing that episode, we were contacted by George's family member, Robina, who also wrote the book The Last Fair, which I also read as part of my research for this case, and it was so beautifully written by Robina. It really brought George and his wife Jessie to life for me. Robina, along with her husband Alec, who is the nephew of George, and Alec's brother Robert, who has sadly now passed away, have been the driving force behind bringing more awareness to George Murdoch's brutal murder. They have never given in and plan to continue to keep George and his story in the spotlight, always in the hope that one day his killer will be brought to justice. Now, Robina emailed me following us releasing this episode about George Murdoch's murder, and we were so pleased when she said that we had done a great job covering the case and that we'd been pretty accurate in our retelling of the case. That really meant so much to us, as that is always what is at the back of my mind when researching and writing episodes, being accurate and only telling facts, never opinions, and always being respectful and telling the victim's story as compassionately as possible. So that meant a lot to both myself and Cole. Robina and I have actually kept in touch ever since via email, with Robina also keeping me updated over the years when there have been any new developments in the case. But until now, we have never actually seen or spoken to each other than via email. So I was absolutely delighted that both George's nephew, Alec, and his wife, Robina, agreed to speak to me for this episode. And it was an absolute pleasure talking to them both at last. However, before we get to my conversation with Alec and Robina, firstly, I want to introduce you to Ryan, the host and producer behind the award-winning podcast, Who is the Cheesewire Killer? For this 5-part episode podcast, Ryan spoke to George's nephew, Alec, and Alec's wife, Robina, as well as Detective Inspector James Callender, who continues to work, along with his colleagues, on George's case as and when any new leads come in. Ryan also spoke to George and Jessie's next-door neighbour at the time of George's murder, who was a 13-year-old boy at the time, and who was so compassionate and caring towards Jessie, George's wife, following his murder, and really helped to get Jessie through the most difficult time of her life, the loss of her beloved husband. It's a beautiful story that will fill your heart. So if you're unaware of this case, you can either listen to our second ever episode, The Cheesewire Killer, A Taxi Driver's Last Fare, or you can listen to Ryan's podcast, Who is the Cheesewire Killer, where you can hear the full story and hear from those who have been involved in the case for quite some time, as well as hear reenactments which bring George and Jessie to life. That's Who is the Cheesewire Killer. If you have listened to those episodes, or are already aware of the case, let's hear from Ryan now, where he gives a bit of a recap just to remind everyone of the murder of 58-year-old George Murdoch. Welcome to the podcast, Ryan. It's really nice to have you on.
It's brilliant to be here. Thank you.
I've waited so long for this. It's been in the making for a while.
Yeah, it's been about a year.
I know, but we did it.
It's taken a year to get together, but no, we've eventually done it. 8 o'clock on a Friday night.
I know.
Brilliant.
Okay, so obviously we're here today to talk about George Murdoch's case, which obviously you covered in your podcast, Who's the Cheesewire Killer. So can you just, for our listeners, just give us a little debrief about what the case is about?
So George Murdoch was an Aberdeen taxi driver on the 29th of September 1983. George went out in his normal working taxi job. He was 58 years old at the time. He left his house at 4 p.m. that afternoon. And that night he dropped somebody off in his taxi. He called into his office to say that he'd picked somebody else up at the side of the street, and for some unknown reason, he turned into a side road called Forrell Station Road in Aberdeen, just in the west end of Aberdeen, about a 10-minute drive from the city centre from where he would have picked up the person. He drove into this road, and for some reason, the passenger from behind him took a cheese wire to his throat. George miraculously managed to escape the clutches of him and get out of his taxi, but rather sadly, the perpetrator managed to actually physically strangle him at the side of the road with his hands. So it's a case in Aberdeen that's very well known because of the extreme violence shown during it, because of the mysterious act of somebody, well, First of all, the brutal act of somebody carrying that out, but also what makes it really mysterious is the fact that a cheese wire was used in it. The fact that cheese wire was used, it's obviously a very, very strange weapon. Why would somebody be carrying a cheese wire on them? And to this day, unfortunately, the case remains unsolved. At the time, there was several leads the police explored, which we might come on to. There's been several developments over the years also, but to this day, as we stand right now, the case is unsolved.
It is, sadly. So Ryan, on your podcast, Who is the Cheesewire Killer, you spoke to Alex, George's nephew, and his wife Robina. How was it speaking to them? And why did you decide to do the podcast? Were you aware of the case as you're from Aberdeen and just wanted to get involved?
Yeah, I knew of the case, but the only thing I knew of the case was taxi driver, 1980s, murdered, cheesewire. That's all I could have told you about the case. My actual daytime job, my 9-to-5 job, is producing radio commercials. Alex and Robina Mackay, the nephew of George and his wife, they actually carried out a radio campaign on our local radio station, Original 106 in Aberdeen. And that's how I met them, because I actually produced the commercial. And I've produced radio commercials for hundreds of different businesses, from carpet shops to auto dealers, but this was the first time that anybody had ever commissioned me to record a commercial looking for information about a killer. So I spoke to Robina and I said to her, once I got told more information about the case, I said to her, have you ever thought about doing a podcast? At that point, I'd never done a podcast before. I've got an audio background. I'd always wanted to do a podcast, and she and her husband, Alex, George's nephew, they kind of jumped at the chance, because anything they can do to keep it front of mind the public, they will absolutely do, and they will support. And they did that. And I must admit, at the time, I kind of felt detached from the whole thing, because I didn't know George. I didn't know the family. I didn't know much about the case. But the more and more I did about the case, the more that I found myself going down a rabbit hole, basically, of a really, really sad story. And the more I got to kind of feel that I knew George, to the point that, George's family always called him Dodd. Dodd was the name that he was affectionately known by his friends and family. When I started off doing the podcast, I was always calling him George, and slowly, and I started to call him Dodd. I felt connected to him. And during the podcast, it was really important, because his murder was from over 40 years ago. A lot of people, sadly, that were around at the time are no longer here. Obviously, George's wife, Jessie, who was left a widow in her late 50s, she sadly passed away. So there was nobody really around that we could really speak to. There weren't many people around that we could still speak to. So for me, I really wanted to give Dodd and Jessie a voice in the podcast. So we brought in actors and actresses to kind of play the part of these people that were important in the case, to try and give them a voice. And really, there's scenes in the podcast that nobody has a clue what was said at the time. So some of it is for dramatic purposes, but it's just to give people, try and draw people in a bit more, and kind of give Dodd and Jessie and their family a voice. It
just humanises them a little bit as well, when you just add that, people want that story. It connects people a little bit.
100%. Yeah, absolutely.
And you also spoke to the detective working on the case, who works on the case now, James Callender, but you also spoke to the neighbour, who was the neighbour of Jessie and George at the time, who was just a young boy.
He was 13. It was a really sensitive part of the podcast, of the series, because Robina and Alex had welcomed me to do this podcast with open arms. But when I started to try and talk to other people, it was really, I had to handle that very sensitively, particularly when it came to David. David was 13 at the time when Dodd was murdered. He remembers it so well. He very kindly agreed to be part of the podcast, be interviewed for it. And I must admit, it was probably one of the most upsetting parts of the podcast, because he was 13 at the time, and to him, Dodd was like a grandfather to him. He really was. Dodd had no children, no grandchildren of his own, so he doted on his nephews, nieces, and David's sister also. So David kind of grew up with Dodd as a second grandfather and Jessie as a second grandmother. So David remembered and was able to tell me during the podcast quite vividly about the night George was taken away, about the police coming round to the house, and his mum had to go through and sit next to Jessie and comfort her that night. He remembers quite vividly Jessie crying, Jessie screaming. He heard her through the walls, just screaming. And it was just harrowing to hear this. But in the most horrible circumstances came one of the most kindest acts of humanity I've heard in a long time. And remember, this boy was only 13, but he saw how upset, he saw how difficult Jessie found, difficult, sounds horrendous to say, but obviously her whole world was just completely blown apart. Dodd, her husband, was her world. And another thing too, that when Dodd was murdered, his killer also took away his wallet. It only had about £20 in it. Nowadays it would be worth £80. So that was a robbery gone wrong? Don't know. But Jessie was always concerned because the person had his wallet. They also had her address, their personal details. So she was always concerned that the person might come back for her. Irrational, yes, but somebody going through that, I can completely understand why that would have played in her mind. So go back to David saw how upset and how just absolutely devastated she was, but also how scared she was. So David then volunteered to go and live with her. So each night he would do his homework, go out with his mates. He would go around to her house at like 9 o'clock at night, basically climb over the back fence. She'd have a cup of tea and biscuits ready for him. He'd sit there, chat for a bit, and then go to bed. And he did that for 2.5 years. None of his mates had a clue.
Really?
None of his friends had a clue yet. He didn't do this to be the big man or look what I'm doing. He did this because he was just, and he still is, just a lovely, lovely guy that puts other people first before himself. He did that for 2.5 years until Jessie kind of got over the worst of it, and then she obviously felt more comfortable to be alone the more time passed.
It's amazing.
It is. Yeah. And the thing about it is that David didn't tell me this. I had to draw a lot of the information out of him. And the story of what happened to Dodd, there's all sorts of different tangents that people can go listen to the podcast, but there's all sorts of theories. There's all sorts of curveballs and different variants of the case that are really, really interesting. But at the end of the day, the podcast is there to try and get people to come forward, and somebody out there must know something. I called one of the episodes "Somebody Out There Must Know Something" because from speaking to James Callender, the previous detective, the person that found Dodd that night as he was lying on the side of the pavement, everybody said the same thing. Somebody out there must know something.
Or have an inkling at least.
Yeah. Because at the time, it was 1983 it happened. Somebody you would think would notice if their partner or their dad or their brother came home, was out of sorts, was agitated, was upset. So there probably is somebody out there. I mean, it might be the fact might be that the actual killer has passed away. And during the podcast, I said to Robina and Alex, how would you feel if that happened? And they said that they would prefer the person to be alive because they would really appreciate some answers, but even just to know who the person was, to try and figure out from that where they grew up, what sort of life did they have, was this a one-off? For the family, there are just so many unanswered questions.
That's the worst of it all, isn't it? Just the why.
Yeah, there's lots of theories. Was it a robbery gone wrong? Was it somebody suffering from PTSD? Did they have an army background? Were they reenacting out a scene from a film or some sort of grotesque fantasy? Who knows? And unless we find out who that person is, it's a question that very well might remain unanswered.
So now we've heard from Ryan, the host of Who is the Cheesewire Killer podcast, and have refreshed our memories about George Murdoch's murder. Now let's hear from George's nephew Alec and his wife Robina, who have been the driving force behind bringing more awareness to the murder of 58-year-old George Murdoch, and the family members who have gone through and continue to go through, having their hopes raised each time there is a new development in the case, who just want to see George's murderer brought to justice. We'll get to the huge developments that there have been in the case later, but first let me introduce you to Alec and Robina Mackay. We'll hear their story and their memories of George, as well as hear how they began a campaign back in 2015 to get justice for George and Jessie, and just what that involved and the steps George's family had to take in order to start this campaign after George had been murdered almost 32 years prior, and find out what it's been like for them over the years to continue to build awareness of George's case in the hopes that someone will hold the key piece of information.
My name's Alec Mackay. I'm the nephew of George Murdoch, who we call, our side of the family call him Dodd. And my Aunt Jessie and Uncle Dodd lived all over Aberdeen, but probably in my formative years from up when I was about 10 until I left the suburb of Aberdeen called Maastricht, they lived there also, and we were probably about no more than about 300 metres away from them. We saw an awful lot of them, and I think that's one of the reasons why that we've taken up the mantle, if you like. I love them both, and why we're really doing what we're doing.
Yeah, I'm Robina, Alec's wife, and I first met Jesse and Dodd. Alec and I hadn't long met each other, and he says, "Oh, we'll come to my house, meet my parents this particular night." So I went up. This would have been in 76, I think, in 1976. So I went up, and when I went in, I didn't know Jesse and Dodd were going to be there, but apparently they were waiting until I got there just to kind of see me, say hello, check me over, I suppose you could say. And joking apart, I always remember this. I walked into the living room, and they were standing in front of the fire, and they both had this lovely, kind smile on their faces. And the kind of people, I don't take to people easily or quickly, I hasten to add, but I did with them. They just had this kind of, just a really, really kind aura about them. So that was my first introduction to Jesse and Dodd. And the more I got to know them, and I didn't know Dodd quite as well, but certainly Jesse, and of course after, sadly, Dodd was killed, Jesse kept in touch with us very much. When we went overseas, she used to phone my mum. So I knew Jesse a lot better, but I only really knew Dodd for about 7 years. That's about all I really knew him for. But I felt like I'd known him all my life kind of thing. I don't know if I ever told Alec this, but 2 weeks after Dodd died, in my head, we've both got a really, really high sense, a strong sense of justice. And I thought this would be solved quickly. I mean, that's always your hope. And of course it wasn't, sadly. Not through any fault of the police. It was just it is a very difficult murder to solve, this one, because it's just between two people who didn't know each other. So a few weeks afterwards, I thought, if this is never solved, we have to do something. I didn't know what then, but I knew we would definitely do something. And as I say, I didn't realise it would take so long. But of course, we then moved overseas a wee while after that with Alec's work, came back. So we just started, and we started this in about 2014, 2015. Almost immediately after we came back here to the northeast. So that's where we're at.
So when you came back from overseas, and obviously it was still unsolved, what did you do? What did you feel that you had to do something, didn't you? So what was the next steps for you?
So when we came back initially, we stayed in Lincolnshire. We had 2 dogs, and we were both townsers, always lived in a city. But at that point in our lives, or this point, having the 2 dogs, we wanted maybe a little bit of freedom, country, life for them, just give them some more room to roam about. So we stayed in Lincolnshire for a few years, so we didn't immediately come back to our hometown of Aberdeen. Stayed in Lincolnshire for a couple of years, and then sadly, between the 2 of us, I guess, getting on in years, we had an awful lot of bereavements in both sides of our family. I think that particular year, that was 2013, was about 7. So we decided, you know what, I think it's about time we were heading back home, which was always the plan. So we returned here to where we're living now, which is just outside of Aberdeen. We returned back here in 2014. We were doing an awful lot of work to the house, but I had started to think about this already, about how were we going to, what were we going to do, how were we going to start things with Dodd. And in 2015, I believe it was 2015, certainly late 2014, I contacted the local paper, explained what I wanted to ask about. They put me through to one of their senior reporters. So I explained roughly, where we wanted to pick this up, about the murder, whatever. And I said to him, we'll even pay you. And he laughed and he says, "Oh, I don't need to be paid." And he says, no, he says, "Listen," he says, "it will be my pleasure to help you with this." He says, "But all I would ask is that you don't speak with any other reporters or papers for now." And I said, "Oh no, that's absolutely fine." So this guy, Eder, that was a guy, he was so helpful. I can't even begin to explain. He offered to come over to the house, which he did, and we went through everything. He actually remembered the murder because he was getting on. He wouldn't have been quite as old as us, but he was certainly old enough to remember the murder which had taken place. So he says, "Listen, I'll try and keep this going in the papers for about a week." Now that's pretty much unheard of with a murder. It's in the paper, maybe a couple of days, whatever, and it's out again, particularly an unsolved, a cold case. He did indeed keep it going for a week. We were beginning to get quite encouraging reports, from various places. So after that, we wanted to get an update from the police, basically, and see where they were with this, or if indeed they were anywhere. So we contacted them. They said, well, yes, certainly, make an appointment, we'll come in for an update.
We had a meeting with them in 2015. That was 32 years after Dodd's murder. And it was Robina and I and my brother Robert, who's sadly no longer with us. But anyway, we had a meeting with them, and we left that meeting, and we were totally disappointed with that, because it was a cold case, and we just felt that at that time the officer that was in charge of cold cases, and I use the word in charge very loosely, it wasn't really being looked at. It was just a cold case, and it was just like it wasn't a priority in any way, shape or form. So we left there, we weren't feeling great. Now, but as it happened, just at that time, and it was just a godsend to us, Police Scotland were reorganising, and they were moving the cold cases back into their major investigations team. And the person that was going to lead that up was a gentleman called Gary Winter. And from the moment that we met Gary until he retired just over a year ago, something like that. But he was off the case about 2-3 years ago, but he retired about a year ago. It just started to accelerate quite quickly. Now, when I say that, this whole case, and anybody that's involved in a cold case, nothing moves fast. It's glacial, and it's just how it is. So your expectations have got to be tempered when you're doing something like this. And I would say to anybody out there, you're just not going to get anything done quickly. Now, if you're like Robina and I, and you're looking for fast results, we had to really change our mindset in terms of what we were doing. So at that time, and I'll let Robina now come on, because part of the reason that when we went to the police was there were a couple of other cold cases in Aberdeenshire at the time that were being actively pursued.
One was, you may have heard of this, I mean, it was quite a big thing, Brenda Page, Dr. Brenda Page. Yeah. And the other was, Brenda Page's murder, sadly, also took place in Aberdeen, but it was at least, I forget exactly how much, it was at least maybe 5-6 years before Dodd's, so that was even earlier than Dodd's one. The other one, which was round about the same time as Brenda Page's, so again, before Dodd's murder, was Rennie McRae, the Inverness murder, where Rennie McRae and her son had been killed and their bodies had never been found. Now, I can't quite remember at this point which one it was. I think it was the Brenda Page one. But I was reading the paper, and actually I heard it on the radio, I believe, one day, and it says the Brenda Page murder case is being reopened or looked at again. I forget. They always say they're never closed. So maybe it didn't say reopened, but it was being looked at again. Well, I'm ashamed to say my initial instincts were kind of anger, and I'm thinking, so what about Dodd's? Is he just going to be left by the wayside, basically? So, of course, me being me, I immediately called police and got through to the reception, which wasn't really much help. In fairness, these people they're just there, to kind of handle the calls. So I said to the lady, explained, and I says, who I was and whatever, and I says, can you tell me why was it the Brenda Page murder which was chosen to be reviewed again, and not George Murdoch's? And she says, well, there must be new information. And I says, well, I didn't say that on the radio. I says, you may well be right. Maybe there is new information. So I'm now on my high horse, which isn't a bad thing because it makes me get things done. Mm-hmm. So I made further inquiries from the police and such like. And pretty much that sort of spurred Alec's introduction into things, because then he was suddenly going to be taken seriously when they realised that, well, there's some members of family out there who are wanting to get things moving again. And I suspect that may have been one of the reasons why they thought they couldn't, Dodd's case couldn't be ignored because we had raised this issue on these questions and they had to be answered. And if they weren't answered, we weren't letting it go. It just happened to be the case, and it was to our betterment that the previous DI we had spoken with, he was either retiring or he was being moved, I forget which. Nice enough guy, but unfortunately just wasn't really that much interested in Dodd's case. So he was then replaced with Alex's DI Gary Winter, who was and has been phenomenal in furthering this case. Just as the current DI is James Callender, but Gary really was instrumental in things picking up here. So we knew we had somebody in charge who was going to help, not just was going to, who really wanted to help, who really cared about not just Dodd's case, but all murder cases. He just got it, that how much it meant to families. So Alec was, probably still is, a little bit on the shy side.
Really?
Yeah, you would hardly believe it, wouldn't you? Would you?
No.
all the lip he gives me. But anyway, but as a family, his entire family, they're quite a private family. And it's not the kind of thing when a murder has happened, particularly somebody close to you, that you'd really want to shout from the rooftops anyway. So neither Alec nor his brother, and nor did I. Nobody ever really told anyone out with the family about this. I mean, very few people in my work knew, maybe a couple of my really close friends, and the same with Alec, and that was it. Nobody else knew Alec's relationship to Dodd or to the murder victim, and that's how we wanted it to stay. But, as I say, when Gary took over, we'd had long discussions with him, Alec and I, and he said, I always remember, he said to me once, I'd phoned him about, so where do we go from here? And he said on the phone, he says, would Alec be prepared to come forward and speak out? And I says, no, absolutely not. I says, this has been kept close to his heart or to the family for, well, I forget how many years that was, about 30-something, he said. And I said, no, I don't think he'd really feel comfortable. However, Gary, in a nice way, he pressed and he says, well, let me tell you this. He says, we can do this two ways. You can do this with us, with the police, he says, which would be the very best way to go, or you can certainly just do your own thing. He says, but I will say this, it always works far, far better and it's far more successful if a member of the family comes forward. It's just how it is. He says, and people like to hear from that person, he or she. And he says, it also makes my case so much more easy. He says, if he really doesn't want to do it and refuses, then he says, I'll just read the stuff out. If he tells me what to say, I'll read it out for him. He said, it's not as good, but I'm happy to do it if that's what he wants. So I says, well, I don't know. And then he says, I'm sure you could persuade him. And I says, nah, I don't think so. So anyway, but to my surprise and pleasant surprise, as soon as I just mentioned that to him, and he says, yes, I'll do it, that you could have knocked me over. And I thought he must be drunk. And I thought, will you say the same thing tomorrow? But no, joking apart, no, he says, I'll do it. Now, I said, what about Robert? And he says, I know Robert wouldn't want to do it. And he was right, he didn't want to do it. He spoke with him. So he says, I'll do it. So that's how it started. That's how Alec got involved with it. Fast forward a few years to 2018, and that was when Gary decided that he would hold a huge media platform, to which he or his, the lassie who organises this, she invited all the papers, UK-wide, all the papers, all the media. They held it it was right next door to this particular hotel. And funnily enough, it was directly across the road from where poor Dodd met his death.
And was that deliberate, do you think? Do you think they were conscious of that, or do you think it's just...
Yes. Yeah, no, it was deliberate.
Was it? Okay.
It was deliberate, in case they wanted to do any interviews actually at Station Road.
Okay, yes, I never even... I didn't realise it, but anyway, so it was... I wasn't there, but obviously Alec was there. It looked like it was a huge crowd. So anyway, from that particular day, things just, they took off in a way we had never expected. Gary told us that they had received, either the day after or very quickly, within a few days, over 200 responses through email, phone calls, whatever other communications there are. He was blown away. And that's after, was it about 35 years then? 35 years then. It was just amazing. And really, Dawn, from that point, this case has grown. It's far from just dwindling and kind of, disappearing. It has grown in ways we could never have imagined. Gary went on to get it onto Crime Watch, which amazed me that had never been done before. And since then, it's been on about 3 or 4 times on Crime Watch. They have been phenomenal also because they've contacted the now current DI, James Callender, also a great guy who's really done so much for the case. He's very like Gary in a lot of ways. So he's flown back and forth. He's appeared on Crime Watch. That's really been a help.
Okay, so we found out how Alec and Robina fought to bring more awareness to George's case. And finally, there are detectives working on George's case who really care and want to solve the case and get justice for George. And we will hear later just how much attention George's case receives through Alec and Robina and D.I. James Callender's tenacity and hard work. But first, let's hear about some of the major developments that have happened in this case. starting with an appeal that was made on the 29th of September 2022, the 39th anniversary of George's murder, asking for anyone to come forward who knew a male, likely now in his 60s or 70s, of small and stocky build, with a local accent, who frequented Wilson's sports bar on Market Street in Aberdeen in 2015, and perhaps still does, and is known to wear, or has worn, a specific Iron Maiden t-shirt, a picture of which you'll find a link to on our website, scottishmurders.com. Here's how that new information came to light.
That was probably one of the first recent developments in the case. So it goes back to 2015. So bear in mind, this is 32 years after the murder of George. But a man wearing an Iron Maiden t-shirt was sitting in a city centre bar in Aberdeen and discussed the case with somebody else. And nobody apart from the police knew what was said in that conversation. But basically, there were things in that conversation that was said from the guy wearing the Iron Maiden t-shirt that wasn't in the public domain. So I think the guy wearing the Iron Maiden t-shirt had a few drinks. He let things slip, but something inside the person who was talking to him thought, this sounds a bit strange. He's saying things here that he shouldn't know, or he sounds like he knows a bit too much about it. And he went to the police with this information. He or she, I don't know. I don't think we actually know who actually gave this information to Police Scotland, but they went to the police and said and gave the information. And from what they told the police deemed that information as important enough to launch a campaign to try and find this person. So that person absolutely knows something about the murder that the general public didn't, or the general public don't know about it, enough to make that person of interest to the police. So they launched a campaign to try and find this person, and they haven't. Unfortunately, I think the CCTV within the bar wasn't, there was some sort of post or pillar. They couldn't see the person fully. So they've never really got a clear enough picture and identity of this person. But this is going back, so that's 9 years ago now, and that person's never been found. Again, the more people that hear this story, will somebody think, okay, did so-and-so used to have an Iron Maiden t-shirt? He used to drink at that bar. He was around in Aberdeen in 1983. It's not beyond the possibility that somebody will come forward and somebody will identify this person. And obviously, this person is probably not even the murderer, but he knows somebody that knows something, potentially.
Yeah, just give the name, because you just never know.
Yeah.
That's the thing, and that's the crux of it, isn't it? You just, if you know anything or you're suspicious or anything, just come forward anonymously or through the Facebook page.
Yeah.
But just say it, get it off your shoulders, and like you've done your bit, and what will be.
Yeah.
And then there was the picture, wasn't there?
Yeah.
There was the picture that came out as well. I thought that was a really big one. When I saw that, I was like, oh wow, this is massive.
It was huge. It was a huge development in the case, absolutely.
And we'll get to that huge development in the case. But first, Alec and Robina continue to work hard to keep George's case in the public eye. And so Alec is so pleased when he is given the opportunity to appear on David Wilson's crime files. But it would be what David Wilson disclosed to Alec afterwards that would give both Alec and Robina a very different perspective into the case, and of George's murderer.
He said, and you could have knocked me over with a feather, and I'll tell you why. He said, I think this individual would have stayed round about the crime scene whilst all the stuff was going on. You know, the police and all that. Now, that night, one of the first person on the scene was Alan Hendry, Constable PC Alan Hendry. He was close by with his dog doing some training. So they went right there at the time, and Alan wanted to do some more really looking around the area, but he was directed to go west of Aberdeen to Peter Cooter, or Cooter as they would be known as locally, and come back in. This was very close to an old railway track, and walk the way back into where the murder was committed. But Alan really wanted to look around, but he wasn't allowed to. And that's okay, that happens. I mean, people have to make decisions as where they go. But the next morning, he got up because it was September, I think it must have still been light, about 5:30. He got up and he went back down there with his dog, and there was a field close by. And Alan said to us at the time, he said, well, not at the time, he told us once we made contact, when we were starting to look at this, my uncle's case, was that he said, the dog went right over to this part of the field, and it looked very much like I was an imprint of a body, as though someone had been lying there. And so when David Wilson told me that, I said, well, look, David, told him about Alan's story. I says, I owe Alan an apology, because I always thought that was too absurd for words. I thought there would be no way, because this is the trouble sometimes, Dawn. You put yourself in the mind of the killer, and we can't. None of us can, because we're not that type of people. But seemingly this is not uncommon for somebody to have done something like that. And I thought, and I did speak to Alan. I said, Alan, I'm so sorry. I says, I never said anything. I said, but I just didn't believe that could be the case. Now, it may still not have been, but it was interesting coming from David Wilson.
Following David Wilson researching this case and visiting the crime scene, he mentioned to Alec that, in his opinion, there were many traits with George Murdoch's murder that led David to question if perhaps he was looking at a disorganised crime and offender. But what exactly did this mean?
When I first looked this up, a disorganised crime, and this applies to the offender too, it's somebody who shows a lack of restraint on the victim, and also he leaves behind physical evidence. Now, obviously, the physical evidence in Dodd's murder was the cheese wire.
Yeah.
That, in fact, as far as I'm aware, was the only thing that was left behind.
And subsequently his DNA.
Yeah, which he didn't realise at the time. Also, the body's left in situ, and there's no attempt made to conceal it. So, I guess, as Alec mentioned, this field close by, it's a quiet road, there's not that many houses, there's plots, there's, garden plots. So, if he wished to, he could have, he hung around there for so long, killing poor Dodd, or almost killing him. He died fairly soon afterwards. He could have dragged Dodd's body along to this field. He could have concealed it a little bit. Yes, it was going to be found fairly easily, but he didn't. He just left him lying on the pavement. So when I read this, because I know what disorganized, I know what the word means, but I'd never heard of a disorganized crime or a disorganized offender. So that's why I Googled it, and it seemed to me, and it doesn't mean to say this is how it was, that this guy who did this fitted practically every single aspect of what a disorganized offender was. It also went on to say, and I don't really know so much about this, it says it could be somebody who maybe wasn't very intelligent, a low IQ, whatever. I don't know so much about that. And it also said often this kind of person will commit a murder close to their home. And we had always thought this for a number of years. I don't know if we still feel the same, but that area where this happened, this road was situated between Cults and Garthdee. And we wondered, was this an area that the guy either knew well, maybe he lived, but if he didn't live there, maybe he had family who living there. So he knew after this, maybe, he thought, I need to get away quickly now. Why he didn't move quicker before, I don't know. But he would know a house he could have run to, and then he would have been inside. So there was no evidence that he'd ever been there. So yeah, I found that very, very interesting what David Wilson told Alec. And also, as he said about that, where the grass, it looked like it had been flattened. And to this day, Alan Henry firmly believes, had he been able, he had the dog there, and he was with his partner who also had a dog. It would have taken, minutes, if that, to let the dog loose, see if the dog picked anything up. So Alan, understandably, and I would have been the same, I know what Alex said, these things happen, I would have been pretty bitter about that. He was going to be maybe within 30 seconds to a minute of catching the guy. Maybe not, but he never had that chance to find out. So maybe an opportunity was missed, maybe it wasn't. But it did seem to all fit in at the time with what David Wilson said.
I suppose back, they were thinking like what we were thinking. Same with myself. I was thinking, you'd want to just get away. You wouldn't be hanging about in the area. So maybe that was just what the police were thinking too.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's why when this gentleman, the guy who'd served time in prison, when he came forward, what he said, his theory, and that's all it was, and he just wanted to offer this theory because he said to him, it never seemed like a robbery gone wrong. And quite frankly, certainly for me, it never seemed like a robbery gone wrong. And I think you're now the same as well. It could be, but it didn't have the hallmarks. To me, a robbery gone wrong in that scenario would have been the guy perhaps getting in beside George, in the front seat, which was very common back then with single guys. Alec did. Most guys would get in beside the driver because you could speak to him. It was a bit strange getting in behind the driver. But anyway, irrespective. So if the guy had a knife, say, for example, and held it to Dodd's neck or body, either behind him or beside him, and said, give us your money, whatever. That's a robbery. And if there might have been a little bit of a fracas, whatever, either he would have been able to I don't know, maybe just knock Dodd senseless, not kill him, but knock him senseless or incapacitate him, grab the money and run. That's maybe a robbery gone wrong. Or if he maybe cut him slightly, yes, that's it. To put this cheese wire, which is a deadly weapon, I mean, if Dodd hadn't for some reason managed to struggle enough to get it over his head, he would have, without doubt, he would have been decapitated. Because, I mean, that's so, this is what soldiers used to use way back, and they did, especially the special forces. This is why they used a cheese wire, because it was known as the silent deadly weapon. Nobody could make a sound because it was over in no time. So, thankfully, Dodd was able to get it over his head. But by that time, the shock, and he would have obviously been bleeding a bit, the man would have been in shock. So, the guy would have had easy pickings. He could have left it at that, taken the money, taken his wallet, whatever, and been off. That would have been a robbery gone wrong. Why didn't he? So then Dodd got out of the taxi. We don't know how that happened. I can't imagine Dodd would have got out of the taxi to run away, because the guy had already got out of the taxi. So we can only assume he may have pulled Dodd out of the taxi. They both ended up on the pavement beside the cab. There's quite high walls there, all the way down, bordering the houses, and they're stone, they're granite walls. And when Alan Henry, the PC, the dog handler whom Alec referred to, when he arrived first in the scene, he said there was so much blood in the walls. He said, I thought it was blunt force trauma that had been involved. That must have been a lot of blood. So that could only have been accounted for by the guy maybe banging or bashing Dodd's head against the wall. And he then proceeds to strangle him with his own hands. So that, to me, isn't a robbery gone wrong. I mean, the guy was lucky. We were unlucky. He was lucky that somebody wasn't out, other than the two boys, the two 15-year-old boys, the cyclists who came up the road. And apparently, we only knew this I only knew this after the first Crime Watch reconstruction had been done. When the kids came up the road on their bikes, they said they'd heard Dodd shouting help, like in a fairly faint voice, which is so sad. But because they were terrified, I don't blame them. They're only 15, and 15-year-olds back then weren't quite the same as a lot of 15-year-olds now. Some 15-year-olds now might have intervened. They might have even overpowered the guy. But seriously, no blame or whatever to the two kids. Good for them. They then cycled approximately about a mile, because of course there was no mobile phones and no CCTV back then. So they cycled about a mile to the nearest hotel, which I think was a Cults hotel, and they phoned the police from there. So even though Alan Henry was fairly close by, he would have only been maybe like about 1 or 2 miles away. It's so strange. By the time the kids had got to the hotel, phoned the police, and then the police had radioed through to Alan, the guy would have, if he was lying around, he would have still been there. But if he had run away somewhere, he would have been well gone by that time. But this is why I firmly believe, we could be wrong. It's nobody's right or wrong here, because we don't know why he did this, why he just didn't depart the scene very quickly. But everybody who has a theory on this, so the guy who contacted us, who'd served some years behind bars, we and individually, I think we also had different theories at that time. We firmly now, at the time, believe that this guy was right. That sounds to us far more likely than a robbery gone wrong. Now, I don't know if the police, this is my own opinion, and I was thinking about this, if they didn't maybe update this, or if they just said that, maybe so as not to cause panic in the city at the time. I mean, something like this has never happened in Aberdeen. And if you say, like somebody, was going around with a cheese wire and he killed this taxi driver, are you going to panic other drivers? I mean, I'm sure they were panicked enough anyway. I mean, they're so vulnerable. They're in such a vulnerable position. But so robbery gone wrong does make it seem like it's more a specific, a one-off kind of thing. I don't know. And you know what? If the guy is caught, which we hope he will be, maybe it will have just turned out to be a robbery gone wrong. I didn't think it came across as that. It was just so violent. He didn't have to kill him. Once he'd had this fight with him or whatever outside, as I say, Dodd would have been probably even just barely semi-conscious at the time. That's why I was so surprised to hear the kids say that they tell him, shout help. But I mean, did he have to strangle him? And that's not a particularly quick process. It's not like 30 seconds or something like that.
We've heard Robina and Alec mention about a former prisoner who contacted them, and we'll hear about that later and the theory he put forward, and just what it meant to Alec and Robina that he did come forward. But first there was another huge development in the case, when in July 2023 it was announced that a photo of a man wearing an Iron Maiden t-shirt seen in the Wilson Sports Bar might just be able to help police with their inquiries. Sadly, this photo, which you can find a link to in the show notes, only caught a partial shot of this man, as he was not the intended subject, showing part of his torso, with him wearing the Iron Maiden t-shirt up to and including his chin and lip. He possibly may also be sporting tattoos on his right arm, but this could just be a reflection. It is thought this man was in his 60s, possibly 70s, may or may not be wearing glasses, and there's a likelihood that he lives in the Aberdeen area. To this day, this man has not been identified, so have a look at the photo and see if you recognise this man. Robina posted this update on the George Murdoch Appeal Facebook page. Again, you'll find the link to this page in the show notes. And here's what Alec's reaction to this photo was and is.
The reaction on the Facebook page, because people were now trying to look at this and see, God, do I recognise this guy? Because the photo was only of the chin down to his torso. And so that kept it alive a little bit. But I think the police are still actively trying to determine who the photograph was. So it's been a number of years, and so over time you kind of get a little less enthusiastic about that.
Do you know who this man in the photo wearing the Iron Maiden t-shirt seen in Wilson's sports bar back in 2015 is? He may be a regular customer, might visit the sports bar now and again, or this could just have been a one-off visit. But do you recognise this man, or the Iron Maiden t-shirt, who may be in his 60s or early 70s, be of a small and stocky build and have a local accent? The police believe this man could help them with their inquiries. If you have any information at all, you can visit the Facebook page by typing George Murdoch Appeal and either private message Robina or email jidhallfield@mail.co.uk or by contacting Police Scotland. Please be assured that if you contact Robina either by private message or via email, if you should so wish for anonymity, your details will not be passed on to Police Scotland. All of these details and links will be in the show notes or on our website, scottishmurders.com. The description that was released back in 1983 of George's potential murderer was of a male aged between 20 and 30 years old, of slim build, approximately 5 foot 7 inches or 1.7 metres in height, to have had short dark hair worn over his ears, to be clean shaven, and to have possibly been wearing a dark jumper and dark trousers. Cast your mind back to the 29th of September 1983. Were you living in Aberdeen at this time? Does this description bear any resemblance to someone you knew back then? A relative, a friend, a work colleague, a drinking buddy, a next-door neighbour? Did you perhaps hear rumours at the time of who may have potentially been George's murderer? If so, please don't assume that someone else will have come forward with that information. Please believe that any and all information, however small, is so very much appreciated by Alec and Robina, even if it leads nowhere. They will forever be grateful to you for coming forward, anonymously or otherwise. On the 29th of September this year, 2025, it will be 42 years since George Murdoch was so brutally murdered, and his wife Jessie's world came crashing down, her life never to be the same again. Alec and Robina and George and Jessie have waited long enough for answers. Let 2025 be the year they finally receive justice. Now there's so much more still to tell you, including Alec and Robina debunking a long-held belief around the case, just how a former prisoner contacting Robina and Alec and giving his perspective and thoughts on the case has helped not only give a better understanding of who may have murdered George, but has also opened up the lines of communication into a community Robina and Alec might not otherwise have had access to. And we will tell you about 2 further huge developments in the case that were announced. To hear all that and so much more, tune in to part 2 next week. Here's a sneak peek for now.
I was 100% convinced that we had the murderer.
He came forward despite the chances he was taking.
Every tip that we've had in, not one person has asked about the reward.
The other few people who did after that, they were also had served time in prison, all around about the same era, which was good, because in the 1980s, that's the people we want. They're the people who might have heard something.
It's been a bit of a surprise, I think, to both of us. How many people have said they've killed my uncle?
He'd thought about this for a couple of years coming forward, and I think he said that his wife sort of persuaded him, look, why don't you just try it? You never know where it might lead.
But nobody came forward until about 6 weeks after the murder that someone in Mr. Chips, which was maybe about 2-3 miles away from where the murder occurred, someone had gone in there that night after the murder and had cuts on his hand, face, blood, but it wasn't reported for 6 weeks.
Either that same night or the day after, 2 guys came forward, 2 ex-prisoners, and then the next day, another guy came forward. Now, I was so excited by this. I mean, they all had their own name. They didn't know each other. They all had their own names of who they thought, and they didn't just thought, they were 110% convinced these people had killed Dodd.
I never attached any significance to that story quite. But this is, again, Don, me putting myself in the murder. I say, well, who would go in for a supper? But we're not the murderer. And seemingly, they're so detached, and it is possible they could do that. But in this case, it was very interesting because it was a bit of a whodunit.
In 2023, on the 40th anniversary of the murder, they made public that they have DNA.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.